With great suits come great secret abilities. Spider-Man has been doing the superhero thing for almost 60 years by now, and let me tell you, you don't get to save the world that many times without filling up your wardrobe. And Spider-Man in particular has more outfits than most people have sandwiches in a year. Some of these suits simply have alternate designs, but others have specific abilities that don't always get brought up and tend to be forgotten about. So let's take a look at some of the quirkier functionalities the friendly neighborhood Spider-Man suits have had throughout the years. Okay, this one is not exactly hidden. You've all seen it on the suit from Spider-Man Homecoming. But it is nonetheless a function of the suit that doesn't always come up, and for a very long time it sure as heck didn't show on the design in the comic books. I am of course talking about the good old utility belt. What, you thought Batman had some kind of monopoly on utility belts? Where else is a young superhero gonna keep all his web fluid? This is also usually where he keeps his smaller camera so he can make that sweet Daily Bugle cash and keep himself out of crippling poverty for another issue or two. But that's not all. This is also where he keeps his famous spider tracers. This is a device that I'm sure fans of the 90s animated series will remember, considering he used it all the damn time. It is very practical though, as it allows Spider-Man to track his opponents whenever they slip away from a fight to carry out their schemes elsewhere. Provided they don't notice the big blinking beeping spider attached to them, of course. And speaking of gadgets that the Dark Knight doesn't own the exclusive rights to, Spider-Man has his very own spider signal. It just doesn't quite serve the same purpose as Batman's. While in the Bat's case, the signal is a colossal projector used by Commissioner Gordon to call on Batman whenever the Gotham PD needs a helping hand, Spidey doesn't really have an awful lot of friends on the force. I mean, heck, half the time they're trying to arrest him on sight, so they most often don't really have a direct line of communication like that. Instead, Spider-Man's signal is attached to his belt and does little more than project an image of his iconic webbed face onto any nearby surface. Now, the reason you don't see this signal very often is that, well, it's not very practical. He tends to mostly use this to announce his arrival to thieves in order to startle them long enough to get the first few hits in. It does make for a pretty good flashlight though, as long as you're okay with constantly pointing at stuff with your crotch. I think I'm just gonna stick with the flashlight on my phone, thank you very much. So, if you've ever taken a closer look way back at the first few Spider-Man comics drawn by Steve Ditko, you've no doubt noticed Spider-Man's infamous web pits. These are something that has disappeared and reappeared over the years, as writers and artists can't seem to come to an agreement on whether or not they're cool. But even though they weren't originally drawn with this purpose in mind, they do sometimes give Spider-Man an extra ability: gliding. You've seen it in Spider-Man Far From Home, of course, but several of Spider-Man's suits have allowed him to glide for a while in the comics too. One of his lesser-known suits, the Dusk suit, which Peter used along with 3 other superhero suits when there was a bounty on Spider-Man's head, took things a step further. This thing had such great gliding abilities that it almost might as well have been straight-up flight. It also made for great camouflage, but then Peter was never super fond of being this dark nighttime Avenger style of superhero. And by the way, the other 3 were called Ricochet, Prodigy, and Hornet. Yeah, Spidey was trying out a lot of superhero archetypes on that one. So he ditched this suit at the first opportunity, and it's only rarely been seen ever since. Shout out to the slingers. But speaking of camouflage, that's another little nifty feature you can find in quite a few Spider-Man suits. I mean, yeah, crawling on the walls and ceilings gives you a great many options for stealth, that's true, but it's only a matter of time before your enemies get wise and start actually looking up on occasion. And that is why Peter eventually made the stealth suit. Yeah, despite what that giant red LED looking spider on the front might tell you, this suit has the ability to turn completely invisible by warping light and sound around it. Another suit that cartoon fans might remember being able to turn invisible is the one Peter wore in the, let's just say, divisive cartoon series Spider-Man Unlimited. For those that don't know or don't remember, Unlimited was a show where Spider-Man ended up living on an alternate Earth ruled by a villain known as the High Evolutionary and his Bestials, where humans were treated as second-class citizens. It didn't exactly last very long. This suit was made by borrowing some tech from none other than Reed Richards, who has helped Spidey with his outfits on multiple occasions, like when he was a member of the Future Foundation. And that suit could change color, so that gave Spider-Man the ability to switch between going solo and being on the clock for the Foundation at will. Which is neat, but not quite as neat as invisibility. Being a superhero is, of course, dangerous work, especially when it seems like every other 2-bit sociopath ends up getting some manner of mind control power. And while this isn't a power that Spider-Man runs into regularly, Mysterio tends to prefer illusions, he actually does have a few opponents that can mess with his mind if they manage to look him in the eyes, but they're all pretty obscure. Yeah, go right ahead and impress your friends on Spider-Man Trivia Night by bringing up such classic rogues as Willow-Wisp, the Hypno Hustler, and Iguana. You'll definitely be the coolest kid at the party. Still, it's a bit of a problem when it happens, and that's where those big, beautiful bug eyes of his come in handy. Not only do they protect him from dust when he's swinging around, they actually warp an opponent's hypnotic gaze just enough that he can usually shake it off and keep ticking without becoming a drooling hypno slave. So, we've covered the eyes, but what about the ears? Spider-Man has a tendency to run into various forms of sonic-based trouble surprisingly often. Not only do several of the many people that have been the Hobgoblin use a sonic scream as a weapon, but symbiotes as a whole are usually weak to sonic-based attacks. Which is fine for incapacitating them and everything, but it's pretty risky to pull something like that off when you aren't exactly immune to noise yourself. But that's where being a tech genius comes in handy. Many of Spider-Man's suits, including the stealth suit mentioned earlier, include earpieces that allow Spider-Man to not get knocked on his spider butt as soon as someone screams loud enough. And yet they still keep his hearing as sharp as it possibly can be underneath that mask. Try and think of it as the superhero equivalent of remembering to put in earplugs before you go to that violently loud metal concert you've been looking forward to all year. They're also found within the Mark IV armor, but believe me, we'll get to the Mark IV armor. That thing is a Swiss Army knife of super tech. The Iron Spider is most certainly one of the most famous of Spider-Man's many armors, and honestly, it's for a good reason. It was heavily featured in one of the most well-known major Marvel comic book events, more specifically Civil War, and it solidified what now has become a bit of a tradition of pairing Peter with Tony Stark. Plus, with the red and gold coloring and those extra robotic spider limbs, it just makes for a really cool design that is super difficult not to love. This being a stock product, it is of course packed up the wazoo with all kinds of tech, including most of the things we've already mentioned so far. But one of its more unique features was its ability to detach pieces of itself when necessary, like whenever Spider-Man might find himself needing to handle hazardous material from a distance, like, say, a radioactive asteroid or something like that. Sticking with the Iron Spider for a minute, it was clearly built to be prepared for anything. After all, you never know exactly what kind of trouble you're gonna end up in when you're a superhero. Is this the week where a flying supervillain drags you so high up that you can't breathe? Is this the week you suddenly find yourself shot into space? Is this the week Hydro Man finally stops being such a wet noodle and... Actually, who am I kidding? Hydro Man is never gonna shape up. What I'm trying to say is, superheroes may end up in a situation at any time where they just can't breathe. And that's why the Iron Spider is also outfitted with containers of compressed air, allowing Spider-Man 8 minutes worth of oxygen. I know that doesn't sound like a lot, but when you're a fast-thinking tech genius superhero like Peter Parker, 8 minutes is more than enough time to come up with a plan and think of a more permanent solution. On top of that, the mask also has a lot of air filters, so good luck with those gas attacks. They're not gonna work. Since we're on the subject of armor anyway, let's go back to the OG Spider armor. This slick black and silver piece that Spider-Man built back in 1993 when he had to fight the New Enforcers, a whole gaggle of supervillains and street gangs that were using much more advanced high-caliber firearms than Spider-Man was used to dealing with up to that point. And I mean, there were a lot of these guys. To name just a few of them, we have Dragon Man, Blitz, Eel, the Super Adaptoid, Thermite, Mentallo, Mr. Fear. Are you taking notes on these? Cause there's gonna be a test later. I mean, yeah, our boy may have super strength like nobody's business, but he's not immune to getting shot. It's a good thing then that he could go home and whip himself up a new bulletproof costume and lay the smackdown on all those baddies. The costume wasn't exactly a perfect solution, however. While it looked cool and made bullets bounce right off, it didn't exactly provide much else in terms of new features, and using it came at the cost of severely crippling Spider-Man's agility and speed due to its weight. And I don't think I need to remind you that Spider-Man's mobility is what makes up a pretty hefty chunk of his fighting prowess. So the Mark I armor was shelved after only one use. But many more Spider armors followed. Case in point, Spider Armor Mark II. This one was created during a time when Peter had lost his spider sense. You know, the thing that usually allows him to dodge bullets. Which, thanks to that good old Parker lock, obviously meant that he soon had to face a mad gunman going by the charming name of Massacre. So, since making a bulletproof costume worked so well before, Peter went back to the drawing board, and this time he came up with a more lightweight suit that didn't sacrifice his speed or mobility. However, the really interesting part was the magnetic webbing. You see, Massacre isn't just some gun-toting lunatic. He is a careful planner, and he likes to set up remotely activated explosive traps to blow up any of his targets at any time from just about anywhere. It makes for some pretty good insurance against superheroes who want to punch you in the face too. The magnetic webbing was able to severely mess with the radio signals, however. This made sure that Massacre couldn't make use of this trick and made him a prime target for a good old-fashioned spider beating. But much like the Mark I, this armor really only got used that one time. And so did the Mark III. This one makes a major step up from the previous two armors, and that's out of pure necessity. When a dying Dr. Octopus decided to gather a particularly nihilistic Sinister Six and planned to wipe out the majority of humanity simply so the survivors would remember him for it, Peter put all his technical know-how into making yet another spider armor to deal with the crisis. Aside from having many of the abilities that we've already talked about, one of the remarkable things about the Mark III armor is that it has audio and visual enhancements that make dealing with Spider-Man's enemies way easier. The visor, for example, made it easy for Spider-Man to pretty much immediately see through all of Mysterio's holograms, while the hearing enhancements made him able to pick up incredibly low frequencies. He used it to locate a disguised chameleon by drowning out all other noise and focusing on his heartbeat, rendering the villain's disguise completely moot. Notably, this is a trick often used by another hero Spider-Man has teamed up with time and time again, Daredevil. Maybe the man without fear super senses are what inspired Peter to make this feature in the first place? Who knows? The most striking feature of the Mark III armor, however, has got to be the Pink Hippo App. And yes, I know that it's a really silly name, but this thing is an absolute beast, even if it is very situational. When it came time for Spidey to fight Sandman, who is able to quickly shapeshift into just about anything and can be a real handful for Spidey to take down, the web slinger sprayed him with some radioactive solution. On its own, this didn't really do anything. But once Spider-Man turned on some sensors in his visor, he could then locate the one grain in Sandman's body that functions as his core. Once this grain was located, Spidey could then simply whip out his smartphone, activate the Pink Hippo app, and basically force Flint Marko to change shape as he wanted, rendering the big guy's abilities completely useless. It makes for a damn good example of what Peter can do when he actually has the funds and stops screwing around, but I highly doubt that this trick would ever work again. Especially considering he shelved the Mark III in favor of yet another spider armor. Yep, we've made it to Spider Armor Mark IV. This one was made during a time where Peter was now the owner of a worldwide tech company called Parker Industries, and it is an absolute beast of a suit. It's a pretty good bet that the Iron Spider we see in the MCU films were at least partially based on this number, since it has more tech inside of it than you can possibly shake a stick at. And speaking of the MCU, do you guys remember that gag back in Homecoming about the web shooters having a completely insane amount of web combinations? Well, that was a thing in this armor too, and it gave his web a lot of properties and uses, the most remarkable of which being the acid web and the concrete web. The acid webbing shot a stream of acid strong enough to melt directly through solid steel, and the concrete webbing was, well, a very fast-drying concrete. But we aren't just talking about any random concrete here. This was powerful, almost instantly drying super concrete strong enough to not just hold a collapsing building, but even stopping the Hulk in mid-rampage. Or so he claims at least. Might want to be a little more careful boasting like that, Peter. You won't like him when he's angry. Considering how often entire cities get wrecked in various super scuffles in the Marvel Universe, this might be worth selling to construction companies in the future. You know, just a thought. Fire is the ultimate cleanser, and it is a favorite superpower of many a hero and villain looking to get particularly flashy and destructive. Now, Spider-Man doesn't have a huge amount of fire-based villains. Even the Molten Man is generally based more on heat than flame exactly, but he does have a habit of leaping into burning buildings to rescue people. And I mean, hey, even he sometimes fights villains like Scorcher, so it only makes sense to add fireproofing to the laundry list of abilities that the Mark IV armor has. Yeah, there's another one for Trivia Night. But we've established by now that Peter likes to go one step beyond, so of course this isn't any old run-of-the-mill fireproofing. No, this armor can resist flame to the point where even the Human Torch can't harm it. For reference, Johnny's flame blasts have been stated to sit at a temperature of about 2,800 degrees Fahrenheit, which, in case you don't know, is the melting point of iron. The suit can absorb other energies as well, making it similarly resistant to Dark Force weaponry, lasers, ice. There's basically no stopping this absolute tank of a suit. Okay, so Spider-Man's various suits have had defenses against almost anything by now. They've been bulletproof, fireproof, sonic-proof, hypnosis-proof, drowning-proof. I mean, are there even any ways left for an honest supervillain to kill this guy? Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, what about poison? And that would be a really good idea, but nope! Try again. You see, Spider-Man had been in one too many fights against a new iteration of the Zodiac, which in this case was an organization of Zodiac-themed villains led by Parker Industries' biggest shareholder, Vernon Jacobs. This Zodiac was very cult-like and divided into several Zodiac-based sects, and like any good cult, they were especially fond of offing both themselves and others using a fast-acting Zodiac poison. So what did Peter do once he got a little too tired of people keeling over before he could arrest them or get any useful info out of them? Easy. He whipped himself up an antidote and built some dart shooters into his suit, making him able to easily and quickly counteract the poison. Of course, he was smart enough to include many other antitoxins with this, and the Mark IV is now basically a walking pharmacy ready to quickly cure him of any poison. Honestly, I wouldn't be surprised if he had a cure for the common cold in there somewhere too. And there you have it, a whole buttload of super abilities for a whole buttload of suits. It helps to be ready against your many enemies after all. Even this most likely isn't even close to all of the abilities the suits have had, so feel free to fill us in on some more in the comments.